So hello from Krishna, who unfortunately couldn't make it. Well, I say unfortunately for us that she couldn't make it. She's actually getting her citizenship today. And so we're excited that she got to do that. So we're really excited about that. I'm Christine, CFR, and I'm the Director of Product Marketing at Akamai, which is like 2 stops down the red line over at Kendall Square. And I'm happy to be speaking with you. Before I was a speaker, I was one of the organizers at Startup Boston, so it's really great to be with you. I'm going to let my co-panelists introduce themselves. Let's start here with Stephanie, and then we'll ask Janice and Karen to jump in.
Hello, good afternoon. My name is Stephanie Capoletti. I'm the COO of Chariot Payments. We're an early stage startup bringing a novel, technologically advanced solution into the payment space. I previously was in the corporate world for about 20 years. So I have learned to run every aspect of the business from that angle, gained an amazing amount of experience and insight. And now in this startup role, I have the ability to apply all of that experience. And I'll be happy to share my viewpoint with those of you that are interested. Thank you very much.
Janice? They told me to
Hi,
speak
everyone.
into the microphone.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm Janice. I'm the co-founder of True to Form. We are an AI startup that helps shoppers find clothes that fit using a personal 3D avatar that they can generate via our mobile app. I actually started my career in Boston working in corporate consulting, and then am actually a recent grad from my MBA program at Booth. I finished last summer, and now I'm working full-time on my startup. So I have a number of different experiences across both corporate and startup now that I'm happy to chat about and share my experience with you all about.
Thanks, Janice. Karen? I might be saying your name wrong, so we're going to need you to say your name again.
So it's pronounced as Karan, but you're very close to the right pronunciation, so full marks on that point. Hi, everyone. Actually, I'm calling in from India today, so greetings from this side of the world. I'm Karan Kishorpuria. I run an agro-processing company called Regal Resources, where we convert corn to make chemicals to serve the food, pharma, textile sector. And interestingly enough, this is a fairly young company, started in 2018, but has now grown on to become a multi-100-person organization. So have good view from going to startup to somewhat semi-corporate. In the past, I actually studied at Northeastern, so very close to Suffolk. And at Northeastern started the first of its kind impact fund called NU Impact, wherein we raised about $500,000 to invest in for-profit enterprises and do some angel investing as well on the side in companies that I believe in and founders that represent big ideas. So excited to be speaking to you all and looking forward to the panel ahead.
Great. Thank you all. And so feel free to ask questions as we're going along. But I think one of the things, just to kind of kick us off, was something in our preparation that a lot of people have been asking was like, what's the culture difference between startups and, let's call them more established, because the definition of corporate can kind of vary, and there are lots of different sized companies in that environment. So Stephanie, do you want to go first, having been on both sides? What your experiences have been with the culture?
Happy to. So in terms of the culture, I would say that more established companies and organizations are definitely, I would say, getting closer and closing the gap in terms of a culture fit to what we know today as startups. And what I mean by that is there are definitely programs and efforts to be able to create a more collaborative, open, energetic culture in more established companies. So that's just something to consider when you think about, I think, the the norms of what we all consider a large established company versus a startup. And also a startup isn't always, hot and cold running food and, bring your dog to work. There's a spectrum across different organizations. And those are just, things to keep in mind from a culture perspective, what makes sense for you at what point in your career.
Right. I've definitely noticed that too. So I've been at Akamai 3 years. and we're about 10,000 people, which is like the biggest company I've ever worked in, and almost always smaller companies and startups where I've spent most of my time. And for me, I think the biggest cultural difference is there's a lot of attention to kind of the context around you, right? Like, what does your office setup look like, and what kinds of things do you have, and what do you need from your colleagues? And in startup world, it was just like, okay, but I'm doing stuff, and it's just like constantly doing things, and you're not necessarily always having the opportunity to kind of step back. And on the opposite side, I think too, like culturally, one of the hardest things for me to learn was that startups think in such short time frames. Like, you might not be in business tomorrow, you might not be in business next week. And I remember the first project that I was working on, and they were like, well, you have to get us the content by this date because it's going to take us 3 months to publish this thing. And I was just like, the idea of like doing something 3 months in advance was like completely startling to me. So culture wise, like the sense of time was kind of a big thing for me. And I see you both nodding on screen. So Janice, I don't know if that matched your consulting experience at all.
Yeah, I think a number of what you guys said definitely resonates with my experience. I started my career in a consulting firm that was actually fairly entrepreneurial. It was about 15 people when I started, and a little over 30, maybe 33, 35 when I left. So it was still extremely entrepreneurial. And despite that, I still think there are some differences between something like a consulting job versus something like a very early stage startup, which is where I am now. Definitely in a consulting setting, you get a lot more mentorship that's built in structurally. And you also, as a result of the project based structure of it, you also get some more hierarchy as well. So a typical structure would involve, maybe an associate reporting up to a manager who then reviews your work, and then it's passed off to maybe a VP and then a partner. And there's a series of checks and balances that go into that structure at a consulting firm or more of a corporate structure. Where at an early stage startup, you really, even as potentially an intern or an entry level position, you're expected to make pretty big decisions. Nobody's really checking your work. They don't really have time to check your work. And so there's a lot more independence and a lot more, bias toward action that I've seen in the startup environment.
Okay. Karan, any thoughts that you wanted to add there?
I think I resonate with a lot of what you said. A couple things I feel is a lot of times culture depends on the value system of the leadership and the management around you, right? So oftentimes they can be synonymous for both startups and for corporates. But I think three things that I've seen work differently for startups and corporates is number one, typically startups prefer speed. I've seen corporates prefer more perfection or attention to detail. Second thing I've seen is startups are generally more unstructured and moving in multiple directions, which sometimes can be counterintuitive, wherein corporates move more slower but more compounded direction. And thirdly, what I've seen is in startups, you are allowed typically to throw things on the wall and see what sticks. In corporates, you want to make sure that there's Fevicol on the wall, and then you want to throw something to make sure it sticks. So those are some 2 or 3 points I feel that differ, but after with social media, with so many people sharing their value systems on LinkedIn, I feel that a lot of times it's become synonymous now of how startups and corporates operate, with more younger people joining the ecosystem and more people becoming aware of best practices around the world through online best practices.
Right. And you're all alluding to something that I want to come back to. So Stephanie, you were just saying something pretty important earlier about there are startups of different sizes, right? I mean, there are individual founder startups, and there are startups of 200 people and 500 people. How have you seen cultures evolve or be different from smaller startups to bigger startups?
So for me, my experience really depends on where the startup is along its growth trajectory. So an early stage seed startup, the culture is a little bit of, it's a flat organization. It's a very tight, cohesive team, and everyone is really driving, toward a common goal. And so you have that type of camaraderie, at least in my experience, at a very early stage seed startup, versus if you jump forward to a startup that's a bit more mature on their growth trajectory. A startup who's actually experienced around A, B, C, right? At every one of those milestones, the expectation with reaching those funding milestones is that there's an expectation of growth trajectory at every one of those stages, and that then it does influence the culture pretty greatly. So I say that because as you're looking at this personal journey of how you want to grow your career, if you're really focused in the startup space, it's going to be important for you to understand the startup stage of the company you're evaluating. Where are they, and what that means, and how that will impact what your role will be, what your opportunities will be, and where the growth is for that particular startup.
Right. And Janice, maybe because you are the founder, I mean, I guess you get to create your own culture, right? But so how does your daily work in terms of like how you think about culture in your context of, being a founder?
Yeah, well, from my experience, I've found that culture really does trickle from the top down, kind of to what Karan was saying earlier. And as a very early stage startup, really the founders have a lot of control over their hiring decisions. They hire toward the culture that they want to build. I think as you get to a bigger organization, even to like 10, 20, 30 people, that's where you really need to rely on your management team to also hire people who also follow that culture that you wanted to set for your company. And so it becomes increasingly more important that the people that you hire kind of adhere to those values. And I think when you get to a bigger organization, that's where you see some of the more structure that's put into place in terms of, okay, these are our pillars, this is our mission, we're going to write it down, put it on our website, and we're going to train our recruiting team to hire accordingly.
Right. And Karan, you also were talking about values. Like, are there things that you look for, or were there questions that you've asked in the interview process to help you decide whether a startup has the right culture?
Definitely. We have about 400 people on our payroll right now, and even till today, right, every single person who joins, I am almost interviewing each one of them. Reason being that the hiring decision is so important, right? And a few things like integrity, thinking long term, thinking company first, as much as you think about yourself, being performance driven. These are a few things that come to my mind, right, when thinking about value systems, and just taking it one step further, right. I feel that at the initial stage of a startup, the founder or the leader defines the culture or the value system of the company. And as the startup grows and becomes what we call a corporate at some point in time, right, I feel the values of the company start defining the values of the founder much more, because the company sort of outgrows the founder in that realm, right? So it's very interesting, but I feel that most conscious startups and companies do have a strong set of value systems that they hire with, either consciously or unconsciously.
Great. And just as a quick reminder in between questions, feel free to, if you're watching online, to ask questions in the chat, but also if you're in the room, feel free to jump in and we'll ask questions. Karan, I did want to follow up on that. Talking about interviewing, one of the questions that we've gotten a lot in our prep, and that I've seen myself, is the question of like, is there a difference between what a startup might look for and what a bigger enterprise or a corporate would look for? Like, if job by job, right? Like, is there something inherently different about what people are looking for in engineers, or what startups might look for in a marketing person versus a larger company? Do you have thoughts on that? And then I'd like to ask the whole panel that.
For sure. So how when we look at hiring at our company, and we think of ourselves as a startup, though at some point we want to graduate to becoming a corporate as well, from a structure lens and thinking long-term lens. So we think of hiring three types of people, right? The first type of people are people who are young, hungry out of college. They don't have a lot of experience, but they are outright hustlers, where if you give them a task or a project, they'll get it done. The second kind of people are more foundational people, thinking compliance, accounts, finance, wherein if you don't know the subject, you cannot do it. And for that, you want someone who's a little more comfortable working with the computer, working on Excel, Power BI, etc. And the third type of people, right, is people who you can delegate leadership to and who you see becoming future CEOs, CFOs of your company. So I guess more than the startup versus corporate, it depends on where you are in your company journey and what kind of a role are you looking to hire for. I think for a startup starting out, the first type is more important. If you're in somewhere in the middle where you're structuring your company and now graduating to become a small medium enterprise, then the second kind, which is foundational roles, are more important. And when you start really turning up the notch, taking in big money from VCs, PEs, and looking at future leadership via IPO or acquisition, that's where leadership hiring and succession planning becomes equally important, right? So that's how I would look at hiring per se when taking interviews.
Janice, any thoughts on that?
I would totally agree with that. At my stage, we're very early stage, we're scrappy. What we really look for in hiring is flexibility and folks who take initiative. At any given day, things change and priorities might shift on a whim. And it's important that we hire people who are comfortable in that sense of ambiguity and maybe are tackling a project they haven't had experience in before, but are willing to try to figure it out. I think as a company gets larger and larger, you have the resources to hire more specific experts in a particular domain, whether it is someone who's only focused on design or someone who's only focused on particular engineering tasks. Even our engineers, they wear a ton of hats. You might have started off as a back-end developer, now you're learning web dev. So everyone on our team is always stretching their prior experience to figure out how else they can help out when you are limited in resources as an early stage startup.
Right. And that's a really great point. Certainly I've seen in bigger companies, the job descriptions are much more specific, right? They're not a marketer, they're a content marketer or a growth marketer or a product marketer compared to, just the more general marketing term, which I think, we can all agree that there are benefits to having a more specific role and benefits to having a broader role. And Stephanie, maybe you can talk a little bit about that, like in terms of what have you seen in terms of your experience?
Sure. So I agree with all my fellow panelists. And one thing I would add on to the discussion is I tend to think about the fit of an individual. If I'm in the seat of a student or someone who's looking to change careers or consider an alternative or a new path, I tend to think about the transferable skills, right? So as an individual, as a professional, what are the attributes that a company would look for? And that's regardless of the size or the maturity of the company. It's really about what do I offer as a professional? And I really think about it in the sense of, 3 pillars, right? Leadership, problem solving, and collaboration. And so if you think about each one of those pillars and how we as individual professionals decide to emulate or embody those principles, I think that's where you can be authentic and bring your value forward regardless of the role that you're looking at, in terms of function within an organization or the size of the company itself. So I tend to think about it in those terms, in terms of sort of transferable value.
And so, because this session is for students, not just students, but a lot for students, what's some guidance that you could give to students who are trying to consider one or the other? Like what would make a startup a better fit for a student or a corporate for a student, or maybe the benefit that they might see from one or the other? Any thoughts on that? Maybe Janice, if you want to kick off.
Yeah, so I think the benefits of starting a career in corporate is that you do have that built-in mentorship. I think I mentioned in the beginning, where you'll be assigned to somebody who you can look to for help, for guidance, and there's kind of a path laid out for you in terms of goals that you'll have to achieve, objectives you have to achieve, and there's a lot of people to learn from as well. So not even just your direct mentor necessarily or your direct manager, but just looking around and being in that corporate environment and being able to learn from folks who've been working there for quite a bit of time. That's really helpful. I learned a ton by working first in consulting, and I learned not just the hard skills of how to do a PowerPoint or Excel, but also how to manage people, how to kind of collaborate cross-functionally across teams. And then also, once I became in that management role, how to recruit teams. And, there's more specific initiatives that take place, like a culture initiative and other things that corporate companies have the resources to get you involved in. On the other hand, I think the benefits of working at a startup is you can immediately see the results of your work. And, there's less layers of review and less layers of change before something's implemented. And a lot of the times the leadership would really depend on a team member, regardless of how tenured you are in your role, to really help deliver on a deliverable or provide results. And so that can be really compelling to somebody who is more comfortable in those type of ambiguous environments and have a penchant to kind of figure things out for themselves and aren't, too worried about that. I think what's nice about starting in a startup environment is you experience a lot of different things, a lot of different types of roles simultaneously, because you will be asked to wear a lot of hats. And for that reason, you might have a bigger understanding of a lot of different functions, but it might be a little bit more surface level, versus if you go into a corporate role, you might be, become an expert in whatever particular role you're in, maybe marketing or in business development, but you might not have as much insight into other types of functions too.
Karan, any thoughts on that? I mean, particularly as you mentioned earlier, kind of trying to put structure in place as your company's growing.
For sure, I think I can answer it pretty well, because I'm 25 right now. So very recently I was a student, right? And I have lost count of the number of internships I did while I was on campus. So I'll answer it in 3 quick parts. First is, I think there are 5 ways you can learn, right? You can learn by reading, you can learn by audiovisual listening, watching, by traveling, and then my 2 favorites, which is experience and failure. So I would encourage students in the audience to experience, and second is experience failure as much as possible. The second thing I would say is, if you never ask, the answer you'll never know, and if you never ask, the answer is always no, right? So I think it's never been easier getting an internship, though competition has increased, right? But LinkedIn is a gold mine. So I would encourage students to DM founders, DM corporates. If not, get a full-time internship, right? Just get half an hour coffee for breakfast or during lunch when they're available, just to get insights on what they're saying and what life is like, get secondhand experience. And the third thing, right, is the most interesting people I've met had no clue what they're doing till they were 30. And the most interesting person I know still has no clue what they're doing, even in their 40s and 50s, right? So the only way that, but what makes them interesting is that they keep on trying different things. So if you're a student in the audience, right, I would encourage you, before you decide whether startup or corporate, try both, work with multiple managers, see what you like most, see what makes you tick, gives you endorphins, makes you feel good in the morning when you wake up and go on a Monday morning, and then take a call what you actually work well in. One thing to note is that corporates' starting salary is a lot stronger compared to startups typically. So that's just something to take note of. But typically, startup work is more purpose-driven and more meaningful. So depending on what stream of the spectrum you're on and what you want from life at this point, right, that might be better. But if you never try, you'll never know. So please do try before figuring it out.
And I want to follow that up, Stephanie, because what Karan was saying was also, I think there's the implication there of, to a certain extent, startups require a personality of somebody who's a self-starter, right? You don't know the answer, you can go research it, because there's probably nobody to ask, right? If you don't know, if you're the one marketer in the company, there's nobody else who's going to help you. So how do you think about that in terms of like some decision processes? Like, are there things that people should ask themselves to help them go through that process? Because I love, Karan, your advice about like, I mean, if you can do both of them,
Right.
like, you know, maybe alternate them. But how do you think about being
Sure.
self-starter?
So first, I'll get to the point about, as a student or someone who may be looking to change directions or careers, is the most important thing that you can do to help yourself is to know yourself, right? To know what makes you happy or what you're looking for. And that is so important because it's my true belief that as a professional, we're all, go-getters, smart self-starters. You have a sense of what is going to, float your boat. And so know that going in, because you can, I'm a big proponent of, you can define your environment. And what I mean by that, in getting, to your point, is if you're not or if you are a go-getter, it doesn't mean that you should automatically just align with a startup. Not necessarily, right? You can go into any situation and create your own opportunity. And I would be a big proponent of saying one thing: if you're in a more structured environment, is don't color in the lines as much as you can, right? So push the boundaries of your role. And if you don't have the resources around you in terms of mentorship or network in a startup, you may have more, I think, depth of resource in a larger, more established company. So leverage that. But also, if you are in a structure, push beyond the boundaries of your role. Always have a side hustle. Always be looking for the next thing. Always be pushing, and you can create that type of environment for yourself. Again, I'll go back to this, regardless of what size company you're in. It's really, and this gets back to my, 3 principles of, leadership, right? Leadership isn't about managing teams or hierarchy. It's about, putting yourself out there and leading whatever needs to be led, whether that's in a startup and you have to, get your hands dirty, or if that's leading yourself to find a path. You don't have to know what you're doing or where you're going, but you have to at least know yourself to know, okay, out of this next 3-month gig at this startup, I need to come out of here with some, understanding or some deeper knowledge than I had when I came in, right? So it's just really about knowing yourself, right? And leading yourself as well as other people. So sorry, that's a long-winded way.
No, that's great. And again, reminder, feel free to jump in and ask questions. And I also wanted to kind of follow that up because, again, obviously we did a lot of preparation for this session, and you want to grow and you're talking about like learning all these new things. What does a career trajectory look like? I mean, certainly I think in more corporate worlds, there's an expectation you're not going to get promoted every 6 months, which, can be fine, but you might not be getting promoted every 6 months in a startup either, because I mean, you could make your own, some companies, depending on how big the company is, you can make your own title. So how should somebody think about a career path in either of those environments, right? I mean, because I think we're all used to promotions being the thing that defines the path, but that might not be the right thing for like going forward. Like maybe promotion's the wrong way to think about it. So I'd love the panel's thoughts on that. Anybody want to go first? I feel like I've been picking on people, so now I'm going to let you volunteer a little bit more.
I'm happy to kick it off. I think in corporate, the promotion, absolutely, to your point, is what everyone is gunning for. That's kind of like the milestone or the indicator that you've been successful in your role. And I think that's pretty consistent. And, the roadmap is laid out for you. In a startup, it may not be so clear because you might be in a team of about 3 to 5 people and you don't have a sense of what the structure of the company could look like down the line. So I'd say the measurement of success and the indicators in a startup environment is less really like the promotion cycle necessarily, and more kind of results of like, what have you achieved in your role? Almost thinking about like on your resume, what can you say you've achieved, and what actions like have you really achieved? It's similar to what you would discuss in a performance review at a larger company too. It's all kind of action based at the end of the day. But I think really keeping that's like the crux of what defines how your performance is what have you achieved. And so I think keeping your eye on that and making sure that you're constantly growing in your role and reaching out and trying to find those new opportunities for growth as well.
Great insights. Great insights, everybody. I'm going to throw one out to you. I've been in big companies, medium companies, small companies, startups. What would you say about the role of corporate politics? How to play that game in a big company versus a startup? Because it's a little bit different. What can you contribute on that?
I will actually jump in on that one, because what I think is interesting is depending on the size of the company, I've worked at a lot of startups where the CEO basically just thinks you're like the hired help in the outsourced sense. Like it's their company, it's their thing. You're just supposed to execute on stuff that they've talked about. And honestly, like also it kind of leads to a lot of instability, because like one day they're like the company's going great, and the next day they're like, oh my God, like we're not going to survive till next week. And they don't have to tell you anything because like they're the one who knows everything so about the finances. So corporate, I think, has different politics, but I think in a lot of ways, those politics follow certain rules, right? Like politics in companies are more about, the size of your sphere of influence and, paying attention to like, who are the people who do things and who are the people who do fewer things and, or try not to do things if they can help it. So I've seen both sides, but the interesting thing is that politics, I think, do exist in all places, but you're right. I just think they follow more clear rules at big companies than they do at startups. But Stephanie, any reaction? I know that we've got a lot of people nodding, so I don't want to.
Yeah, I'll let you guys go because
Okay.
I agree with that wholeheartedly. I think that's exactly right on the nose there. So I'll turn it over to Janice and Karan.
Maybe I can share quick thoughts. So interesting question. How I would look at it is politics exist, whether with friends, sometimes with family, or with startups, right, or corporates, right? It exists everywhere. It depends on what you give your energy to. So if I had politics happening around me, would have the option of being consumed by it, leaving that place, or working on my own performance, right? And I would prefer working on my own performance first, then consider leaving that place, then consider being consumed by it, in that order. Secondly, I also feel that most startups and corporates today have town halls, surveys, formalized HRs, and oftentimes I feel like, as a business owner, I feel my employees or my team members are thinking something, but if they're thinking something, it's very hard for me to know that. But if they voice their opinion either anonymously or with their name on it, it's a lot easier to address it directly. So if you're feeling something strongly, right, and it's on your mind for multiple days, I would definitely encourage speaking to your manager, the HR, or anybody in your company, even the CEO if in a startup, about it, because more often than not, they do care. It's just that they have other priorities on their mind for which they cannot address it first. And third, but not the least, right, I also feel that when you are focusing more so on your performance, and that is going high, and you are in a performance-driven culture, right, you care less about the political aspect of it, and how much politics or not depends on the values of the company, the founder, how the interview went on, etc. And you are making that choice as much as the company is making the choice, right, when you're approaching them to hire you and when they are hiring you. So choose wisely as much as the company chooses wisely as well.
So can I add one thing to that?
Please.
So in terms of that political aspect, it is everywhere. But getting back to one of the earlier discussion points in terms of the difference of culture, with a startup, you'll know that much more quickly, right? If those are the politics, the culture of the politics that are tenable to you, or if they're not. You won't learn that most likely as quickly in a larger organization. They'll exist in both places. You'll know a lot faster in a startup whether or not that's your cup of tea.
Good answers. Other questions in the room? I'll throw one more out there. So in that same vein, if somebody knows themselves, know thyself, and they're like, I want to be a leader, or I don't want to be a leader, I like following, what do you think about knowing themselves and how well they'll fit in either a startup or a corporate culture? And does it matter?
I have some thoughts, but I'm going to see if anybody else wants to go first. No, okay, I'll go first. So I think corporates actually love people who want to be leaders because, you hate to say it this way, but like they love when people want to do more work. I mean, like to your point, like if you're like, oh, hey, you're in this other team, but you're willing to do my project, yeah, I'll let you help me. Like no, very, very few times will they say, no, you can't do that, right? There are some, right, obviously, but like not that many if you're just kind of touching adjacent things. So most people like leaders. I think what's really interesting if you're coming out of college is that most corporates, right? Like, I mean, Akamai runs a very specific co-op program, internship program, and it's got a training program associated with it, right? Like different things that they teach all the interns and kind of take them through. So it's very structured, right? That can be good and bad, right? Because if you want to do things that aren't part of that structure, maybe that's a problem. But on the other hand, it's a really great foundation to do other things. And being a leader in a startup can be great too, because again, probably nobody's going to tell you no if you wanted to start something or, take on some new initiative. Particularly, I think if you are like just out of school, because again, they probably don't have resources to have somebody else do it. So it's not like you're taking somebody else's responsibility, and it's a great way to stress test yourself, because I think even though people say like, oh, corporate's like, oh, nobody takes their time off and does this and that, normally there actually are people looking out for you. Like if it's your boss or your coworkers, like, hey, when was the last time you took vacation? Why are you online every time at 11 o'clock? Whenever, like, why do you email me at midnight? Like you need a break. And I think in startups, it's less likely that people see that.
That's an
Right?
expectation. Just could be an expectation in a startup world that's everybody has to run 24/7 with their hair on fire, and that's how you have to be in a startup. Right.
Yeah, depending on the startup.
Mhm.
So you might be taking on all those leadership things, and then you burn out because nobody's going to stop you from burning out in most cases. Janice and Karan, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'll just share a quick thought, right? So number one, Christine, I've had multiple friends from Northeastern do the Akamai co-op, and I've heard fantastic things. Kudos to you guys for running such an awesome co-op program and helping mentor so many students to do amazing things. One of them is actually from my same city in Calcutta in India. So it's very nice to hear that. Quick second thing, now answering the question. So how I look at it is that, like, you might like to run, but one person might like to sprint and another one might like marathons more. So for me, corporates is a lot more slow, steady, but marathons, you need stamina, right? You got to keep showing up day in, day out when you're not feeling good, when you're not feeling bad, and just keep going and consistently racking up those miles. For sprints, it's a lot more like you work those long nights, you drink that coffee, you get that boost, and then you take a break and then you go again. So depending on what you prefer doing, you should go either way. And secondly, I also feel it has a lot to do with your manager also. Like, the number one reason why people switch or stay in jobs outside of the company, of course, is their manager, right? So your manager might be in a corporate environment, but might run their team like a startup centric team with a lot of interaction, with a lot of entrepreneurship, encouraging the company, etc. So balancing out both aspects of the sprint versus marathon, what you prefer, and getting the right manager who matches with your value system, I think might help with the know thyself and the right environment fit.
Right. So related to
Yeah,
that, Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Janice.
Something that Karan said just reminded me of something I learned from one of my entrepreneurship classes while doing my MBA. And it was this concept of how, regardless of whether you're in a startup environment or in a corporate environment, everyone is an entrepreneur. So whether you're an entrepreneur of a startup or you're an entrepreneur and you're innovating within your role, everybody wants somebody who's always thinking out of the box and the qualities of leadership that we're talking about here. And so I think a lot of the points that were raised during this discussion are totally spot on. It's kind of like, in what ways do you want to lead and in what ways do you want to innovate?
We have a question in the room. Please just present yourself and fire away.
Hi, I'm John. I'm in finance. Janice, I have a question for you. And maybe I'll call you the woman in white. Maybe for you as well. And that is, Janice, how do you like to be managed? Because we all have to manage our managers.
So to repeat the question, because it broke up for a second, the question was, how do I like to be managed? Is that right?
How do you like to be managed? Yes.
Oh, yes. Great question. So I love when my team pushes back on, the ideas that I have. Our team is like very collaborative, and we try to create a culture where folks feel like they can voice their opinions. In my consulting career, I was very lucky to be in an environment that really valued 360-degree feedback. And that happened every quarter, not just every 6 months, but we would get feedback from people above us, of course, but also people we manage and people who are our peers as well. And so that gives you a really good sense of, okay, you're maybe considering your manager's goals, but are you also growing your team effectively? And I think having that two-way kind of feedback is extremely important. I think as you're building and growing managers within an organization, that's almost as important as growing the core skills of like any other worker in your organization, because their skills are going to be leveraged across the people they manage. And so for me, I really appreciate when people come to me and say, hey, like, you had thought about this problem this way, or maybe you were approaching this team meeting this way. Like, what about if we did it this way? And I think it makes it a lot easier for people to do that when you create like routine opportunities for your employees to give you feedback so they feel comfortable.
And I guess I'll turn it the other way around, because I think the question is, what are some good practices for managing up, right? So in terms of like how my team interacts with me, and as somebody who's not been great at managing up, I'll just say that over the years, I've always been working on that. The interesting thing is that particularly in startups, because we were saying like you're running all the time, a lot of times you don't tell your boss how things are going, right? Like I remember at one startup, somebody said, well, Christine, I know you always do what you say you're going to do, but you kind of make me sweat it out. Like, if you tell me it's going to be due in 2 weeks, I don't hear anything. And then 2 weeks, I hope it shows, and it shows up. But I didn't know that until it showed up. And so there's a certain amount of just visibility that you have to give people into what you're doing. Like, that's what I do with my team. I've got 3 people on my team, and our check-ins are like not just like, hey, how are things going? How are you feeling? But also, here are the roadblocks I'm facing. Hey, I'm really proud of how this went. This is the next thing on the plate. Because most of the time, your boss can handle things that aren't going well if you told them in advance, or you asked for help, right? Like if you said, hey, I'm working on this project, it's a little rocky, I think I can overcome it doing this, but I just want you to be aware of it, or I want you to have visibility into the challenges that I'm facing. For the most part, I think people have been okay, and I'm okay with that too. And maybe I've got ideas to help. Like, generally speaking, when it comes to managing up, it's the radio silence. Like, you take their input, you do what they asked you to do, but there's nothing in between. And then that's where it can cause a lot of friction in my experience. Everybody's nodding with me, so I'm gonna.
Yes, great
Say
great
yes.
insights. Got another question from the audience?
Hi, my name's Calvin. I'm a mechanical engineer working to pivot from project to product management. The question I have is, other than questions about culture and management style, which often, I feel like people will say the things that they want to say, not necessarily how it actually is. What are some questions you could ask of a potential manager that gives more insight into different things like vertical growth potential or different, experience and learning opportunities?
So I think those are great questions, and you're right. And I think those are the kinds of things that corporates have been trained to give an answer to, right? Like somebody told them, like, these are the kinds of things that you say. When I'm interviewing on the interviewee side, I almost always ask, how is this job measured? I ask what happened to the person. Usually it's like, is it a new role or is it not? I mean, in corporate, it's probably not a new role for the most part, right? And then where did that person go, right? Like, did they get promoted? Did they move to another company? What happened? And then, you can always ask about like what the training programs look like. Like, I would try to ask more specific questions like, do you have a formal training program? Like, I've worked at places where like the goal is like 8 days worth of internal training every year, right? Which is a much more specific question than, how do you help grow your team? Because then you wind up with a lot of theoretical things that like might not kind of really be like they may be true. People believe that they're doing those things, but like if it's not concrete, right, it's just harder. It's kind of harder to prove. So like you always want to kind of go into the like, what's the policy? Do you have a policy on this? Like, is there a target for training that your team has to hit every year? What kinds of training are in that program? Like, those are the kinds of things that I would ask. Stephanie and
Sure. So one of the things that I've found very effective in the interview process as a hiring manager is experiential interview questions, and so that I find can help get through some of the corporate speak, if you will. In your particular case, I was just noodling on this, going from a project manager to a product manager. I would ask questions which are really tangible, right? That there's not wiggle room sort of gloss over, what the manager wants you to hear. It's really about, okay, if you're hiring for this product manager role, what's your product line extension roadmap look like? Very specific questions, because that I think can help you as the person looking to evaluate that role and whether or not it's real and whether or not it's for you and whether or not there's the right level of growth trajectory. It can help you discern on a more sort of objective basis whether or not there's an actual plan to grow that role, right, in the product world specifically.
If I may add a quick point, right? So I actually have a small hack to this, which I've tried employing, which has worked for me a little bit. So the time when you have to ask questions to me is actually one of the only times when you can actually show the interviewer that you are super prepared for this role and you have outworked everybody, because the other part is just standard Q&A with the interviewers asking you, right? So what I would do is I would actually, instead of asking the interviewer, like, I'm a big fan of questions, I would ask people who are either in the similar role in the company or have done the role in the past, what the experience has been like. And I would relate their experiences towards asking questions. And I might, if they have a good reputation, right, I might even name drop them, saying that I spoke to Varadhi, who worked at Akamai, and she mentioned this, and I had a question around that. And that shows the interviewer that, this guy met Varadhi, spoke to her for 1 hour, had the interest to ask a question after that. And the second hack is that every time whenever I wanted a job, though now I'm employing, before I end the interview, I always ask the interviewer, is there any question I should be asking which I'm not? And that sometimes throws the interviewer off when they're thinking if they've given me all the information that they should have about the role, if they're kind about that. So those are two things I might share as small hacks that have worked.
Another question from the audience?
Sorry to make you get your steps. So another question about, this one is about comp and money, which everybody likes to talk about. In corporates, the money is super clear. You do X, you meet your performance, you get X, Y, Z in a raise. But in startups, we don't have money. So I can't give you that. What do I say?
I think we're going to let Janice go first on that one, and then we're going to ask her on. Well, because I'm on the opposite side, so I'm in corporate. I mean, I have ideas of what I might want in that case, but I am not on the offering side of that.
Yeah. I mean, you're totally right. We're completely at an early stage startup. We're completely resource constrained, and it's hard to compete like dollar to dollar, even close to what a corporate could provide, that level of talent. So what you're really looking for to build is the sense of, if this company wins, we all win. And aligning that together to not be like, hey, this is just the monetary base compensation, but if you contribute as an early employee to our startup and our startup is successful, that is really what moves the needle. It's not an extra 10,000, 20,000 here or there. Really, it's this startup being successful and you being here, part of that vision at the earliest stages. And I think people kind of self-select into that kind of risk appetite in terms of, are they fueled by something that is has a very high upside and is mission driven and things like that, or would they perhaps be more fueled by some more stability and a higher pay right out the gate?
I think that's absolutely true. I'll just add one other tidbit. Only in a startup can the CEO come to you on a Friday and say, if you close a deal, I've got $10,000 that's going to go into your bank account. That happens at startups. That doesn't happen at corporate.
Well, on the interviewee side, right? Like, I guess we've all been told, like, oh, well, you can't have more money, but you can have a better title, which I think is great, right? I mean, I think that sometimes that those things matter, but it's not always just those two things, right? I mean, I think there is, like, I think we started the whole session about values and being purpose driven and, really helping build something. Right? Like, I mean, even my company, we're in cybersecurity and, we're powering and protecting life online. Like, that means a lot to me. And I think startups can benefit from that, because I don't know that there are a lot of companies that have that much purpose in, like when you're bigger, right? I mean, like, your team can create it, right? But, I think that that's something that startups don't give themselves enough credit for, in terms of, like, we're doing something, we're building something, we're creating something. Like, that's pretty compelling for a lot of people.
And I think that gets to one of the earlier points as well, is in a startup, you have a much more direct line to impact, right? It's a smaller organization. Everything you do, there's a really clear line of sight to why you're working for, 60 hours a week and what it's going toward and what it's building. So that's that engagement and that passion and that sort of commitment to the purpose, for being a part of that startup, when there is no clear line of sight on, I get X salary and X bonus, right? So it's a different value set that drives you toward one direction or the other at any given point in your career, and it can change along the way.
Absolutely. So we've got about 5 minutes left, 4 minutes left. I've got one more I'd like to throw out to everybody.
Great. And then I've got one more too. So
you go.
no, go first.
We'll do mine very short. When somebody's thinking of their social life and what their social life will be when it's in a startup versus a larger corporation, and how they're intertwined or completely separate, do you have any thoughts on that?
I'm going to let Karan answer that first, because he was nodding along. So when you're doing that, I assume that you've got something to say about it.
Strong views. Yeah. So I definitely feel that it depends on how much you give to either company. But I feel that in a startup world, it's a lot more intertwined because you are a lot more connected to the purpose. You end up working over pizzas at night. Like I've stayed in my office till 3 a.m., 4 a.m. at night, like camped at night in my office, which has its own perks. But beyond that, right, I think we have 168 hours in a week. Typical work, either startup or corporate, is between 40 and 60. We spend about 40, 50 hours sleeping, maybe another 10 hours, like, bathing, restroom, etc. And you have 50 hours left, right? So I think it's how you utilize the 50 hours that you have left that actually defines how your personal and professional life intertwine, not the other way around, because the other way around is standard for almost everyone. It's the balance 50 that most people either use it on social media, either they just like staying in the office, either they have a family to take care of, they have passions like traveling, skiing, etc. So it depends on how you spend the balance of the 168, which happens to be about 40, 50 hours for most people on average. So that's my 2 cents on that.
And so related to that, so it turned out actually that our questions were related because one of the questions we got in advance of the session was about networking and mentoring and how those might be different if you went corporate versus going to a startup. So Stephanie, let's start with you and then we'll do a round robin as our final.
Sure. So I would say that in a larger, more established company, you do have that opportunity for just volume. You can easily go find out from a guy on the next floor, what they do. It could be a completely different function. So there's a definite breadth and volume in a larger organization. But when you're in a startup, it's much easier to go, poke your head over the desk to the person next to you and just, bounce some ideas off of them. Hey, I was thinking about this, right? So I would say that, again, it's not, in my mind, it's not so much the confines of the walls you're in. It's more about how you utilize your time and your footprint in whatever space you're in, and how you are able to really, capitalize on what you have in front of you, right? Because it's not necessarily always going to be perfect. It's about, what you take out of any situation you're in and how you can make the most of it for yourself.
Okay. Janice?
Yeah, I think for startups, you're actually in quite a unique opportunity to create a lot of networking relationships outside of your company. And that's something that I think has been one of the biggest values that I've gotten out of being a founder over the last 2 years or so, is when you're at an early stage startup trying to build something new, innovative, impactful, people want to talk to you. And you have the ability to be like, hey, I'm building this new thing. I want to get your perspective. And you'd be surprised at the caliber of people you end up meeting at these events. And that's incredibly powerful. And definitely for founders, of course, to be meeting with top tier, like top investors and top potential customers, whether it be brand relationships, retailers, in my particular case, or any other customer networks that you're part of, but also as an early employee. Just saying, I'm an early employee at this early stage startup. All of a sudden you'll find that people are very interested in learning about what you're building and are actually quite helpful and go out of their way to find opportunities for you and be supportive of your team. So that's the one thing I wanted to talk about. In my experience, I found it one of the most valuable parts of being a founder.
Great. And that brings us just about to the end of this session. This was a wonderful session, insightful. I hope everybody enjoyed it.